Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. So, big news on the Classic front recently. Ever since the Cataclysm expansion released and the old world was lost forever, players have been pining for an official re-release of Classic. And now that that's out, players have been pining for an official re-release of the Burning Crusade.
You are not prepared!
The big idea is that the game will go down one of three directions after the release of the final raid, Nextramus. Either A, nothing will happen and the game will stagnate, B, they'll work on completely new content for Classic, such as new raids and dungeons, commonly referred to as Classic Plus, or C, they'll do the same thing they did with Classic with the Burning Crusade. Well, very recently, we got a hint of an answer as Blizzard sent out some surveys to players about the latter option, the Burning Crusade, asking them if they would play a re-release of the expansion, and if so, how should they implement it. Now, nothing is confirmed yet, of course, but this does bode well for those looking for the Burning Crusade, as it wouldn't be the first time we got a sneak peek of the future through these surveys. Long before the Shadowlands announcement, one survey asked about the idea of a level squish, and lo and behold, at BlizzCon last year, it was announced the Shadowlands pre-patch would bring just that. I also did some analysis of the release dates as well. Classic released in August of last year, and if you go by raid tiers, we got Blackwing Lair 5-ish months later in February. For major raids, we of course have two more, and that's AQ40 and Nextramus, and assuming that we also have a 4 to 5-ish month wait between these raids as well, that means we'll get Phase 6 and Nextramus around November or December of this year, which lines up perfectly with BlizzCon. So, assuming that Nax is out by then, and Classic is quote finished, what better time than BlizzCon to announce the Burning Crusade Classic? That would be the perfect opportunity, as you'd be able to retain as many players as possible by announcing it on the big stage and addressing that elephant of the room, which is that stagnation. The stage seems to be set, and it lines up suspiciously well. Don't get too far ahead of yourself, but if that's a sign of things to come, all of you BC fans may find that pretty encouraging. However, the logistics behind a BC re-release and how to handle the transfer has been discussed at length between the players. I have a whole video about it in fact, but let's look at each option one by one. So first, presumably, we have all existing servers going to the Burning Crusade, and players are given the option of transferring off to a permanent Classic server that never progresses past 60. And on the flip side, we have the opposite. All servers remain Classic, and you never go past 60, and you have the option of transferring to servers that will progress to the Burning Crusade. And lastly, we have two more options: completely new BC servers where you start at level 1, or completely new BC servers where you start at level 58. So, interesting choices here. They all have their ups and downs naturally. Now, anyone who plays Classic will tell you that the community is a big part of the game. It can be really toxic, that's for sure, but regardless, a big part. You see the same people over and over, and recognize players that you like, and players that you can't stand. So naturally, with talk of all of these server transfers and whatnot, it brings up about 100 different arguments on how it would affect the community, and so on and so forth. I mean, come on. We're talking about a community that has nuclear meltdowns over blob shadows, and doxes each other over ninja looting. Before we get into the pros and cons of each option, I think the most important thing is to give the player the choice, which they seem to be in line with because, after all, this is a survey. So let's just acknowledge the fact that this could be something that they could just force on people, but they're being mindful of what the players actually want, which is a good thing. Each one is tricky though. Starting with one here, the pro of this option is that it most accurately replicates the original launch of the expansion back in 07. You're on an established server, the Burning Crusade launches, and that's it. That's how it worked back in the day, and if you like Classic and you don't want to be a part of BC, you have the option of transferring off to a server with like-minded people. The downside is what I just mentioned. If Current has taught us anything, it's that the community is a very fragile thing, and when you start introducing things like transfers, it can get hairy. Let's say your server has a super active raiding and PvP scene and people are playing all the time, and you like playing Classic, and then the day comes, and maybe 90% of the players went to BC, including your guild and most of your friends, and Ironforge goes from this to this. Option 2, again, is to keep the servers the same, but give the option to transfer off. It's the same idea here. A possible mass exodus of players from Classic to BC, and you're left with a fraction of the amount of players that you used to have in Classic. Another downside of both of these options is that there's presumably no turning back, as these are transfers and not copies. If you transfer off, you transfer off. This makes the volatility in the community even worse, because if there were copies, you'd always have that door open and being able to maybe play both if you wanted to. You'd of course have to combat duping gold and items with copies though, which would be tricky. The only way I know of off the top of my head is for Blizzard to copy the entire server of characters themselves. If you put it in the players' hands, they'll 100% exploit it if they can. For option 3, we have completely new servers where you start at level 1, assuming that existing servers would be capped at 60 still. A pro of this method is you don't directly fiddle with the community on existing servers, as those characters would be untouched and players could always go back if they wanted to. A downside though is that it indirectly affects the community. You're not losing actual characters on these realms, but there still will be a large percentage of players that on launch will never play Classic again, even though they do have the option of going back. Nothing can really be done about that though, as it's a problem that's tied more to the release of BC itself, rather than the method of transitioning from Classic to BC. And another downside is that it wouldn't be as accurate of an experience. In the original launch, we of course had full vanilla raiding gear, a stockpile of gold for some, rare mounts or items, and it's a similar story for starting at level 58. You just don't have to grind as much. I personally prefer that if they go down this route, you start at level 1, because level 58s kinda get into that territory of level boosts. I'm aware that you don't pay for it, but still, there's just something wrong with clicking a button and spawning a level 58, I think. I know that content is mainly aimed for BC, but you get a lot at level 58. Any profession for one. A lot of this stuff is still good for BC. Tanks still use Thunder Fury, so you can get all the Arcanite you want, 18 slot bags with Mooncloth. Plus, this would result in every single zone under 58 to be completely dead, which just isn't healthy. The old world is still important, and starting at 58 would make everything but the Outland barren for the most part. Maybe a solution to this would be to make it a one-time thing, and any alts you level would start from 1. So, like I said, there's a lot to consider. It's not as simple as just releasing the Burning Crusade, and honestly, I think it's a hard choice. All of these pros and cons are pretty close to each other in my book. I think if it were possible, it would be best if we got copies instead of transfers. So for example, we have Fairlena Classic, and then Blizzard copies every character, and then we have Fairlena BC, and that way you don't burn that bridge to Classic forever. This is also the best option for maintaining the community as well, I think. With the first two options, you have a choice. Either you maintain your established communities for Classic or BC, not both. And with 3 and 4, the community basically starts from scratch, whereas with copies, your entire community remains in Classic, and your entire community moves on to the BC in one piece. I guess a downside with this is that you'd basically be doubling the number of servers, which again gets into that issue of are there enough players to support both Classic and BC. All I can say is that if I was capable of emotion, it's definitely excitement. People always ask Classic Plus versus Burning Crusade, and even though I'd play either, I've always said I'd prefer BC because I want a shot at actual progression rating. I played BC, but I was one of those people who played vanilla so much, I kind of burnt out and played BC casually. I also had lots of big life stuff happen to me, so I've always felt like I missed out on the real experience. I think it would come at a cost though. Classic has been doing great in my opinion, but I don't know if it would survive a Burning Crusade release. Blizzard got a huge amount of new subscribers with Classic, but I feel like most people who want a Classic style of MMO are playing Classic right now. I think the jump in subs would be very minor in comparison to when they released Classic. I think it would really cannibalize their own player base, and you definitely see some servers die. I think there would always be a few Classic servers rolling, but if you start rolling out BC, or even Wrath later on, or whatever, I'm still waiting for that Draenor Classic, you're spreading that community pretty thin, and for BC to be successful, it may require that Classic fails. The idea of re-rolling and starting fresh is something that's always really appealing to people, And if they go down the BC route, it'll basically be a great but stagnant game versus a fresh new start, and I think the player base would take a ginormous hit. Current and Classic can kind of live together since they're so different at this point. Current, of course, having 15 years of development added to it. It's almost a symbiotic relationship because they fill different niches, but Classic and BC are so similar, I think, that I'm not sure how many people would really find the time to play both consistently. But then again, what's the alternative? Inaction? How many people do you think the post-Naxxramas stagnation would retain? I mean, I could play Classic forever, but my love for it can be deemed to be slightly irrational to the normal person. Just slightly, though. I'm sure that this will be debated ad nauseum for the next several months, and I'm sure that Blizzard themselves will be looking at how things progress and go from there. Feel free to share your thoughts, either about BC as a whole, or my thoughts on the pros and cons if you agree or disagree. One thing that's for sure is that feedback is more important now more than ever, since they're actively looking for it. So think about it, keep an eye out for that survey, and give them your thoughts. My goal with this video is to hopefully shed some light on each option, so you can provide more enlightened feedback to that survey. As for me, I'm not really sure what to make of it yet. It's exciting, that's for sure, but definitely dangerous to Classic. I'm sure there will be a lot of people ecstatic over this, and others furious. If there's one thing that the Classic community has taught me, it's that everyone's pissed.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.